Welcome back to City Speak. I'm Clarence Anthony, your host and CEO and Executive Director of the National League of Cities. Today, we are lucky to be joined by an amazing local leader who was also just recently elected our new president of the National League of Cities. He is our leader for this year, and he is mayor of Rancho Cordova, California. And that is the great Mayor David Sander. David, how are you doing today?
I am great, Clarence, particularly with an introduction like that.
Well, there's more because you are our first guest in the year of 2024. And I also like to say Mayor Sander is currently the mayor, where he's serving in this role for the fifth time on their rotating city council. He's been with his city from the very beginning. He was first elected to Rancho Cordova in 2003 and has been in public service ever since. Of course, many of our members know that Mayor Sander is also a practicing virologist and is thinking about his presidential platform at NLC in that context of science, which is also always very interesting to have conversations with the mayor. This year, we'll be focusing on cities as laboratories of democracy. And we'll get into exactly what that concept is all about in this conversation. So let's start our conversation. You've been with Rancho Cordova since the very beginning. Tell us about what that process of building a new city from the ground up was like.
Well, in a couple of words, it was a big challenge, a really big challenge. Perhaps the largest challenge of my life, I would say. On that election night, as we stood around and looked at each other, the five of us who had just been elected to a non-existent city, but a city who had just been voted in that very day by the people of Rancho Cordova, we were it for city government, the five of us. There was no staff, there was no infrastructure, there's no of the city, there was no city hall. The five of us were the sum total of city government. And so, from that basis, we had to establish a new city in an area that had been populated and developed for decades. Sacramento County is a little unusual. They, beginning after World War II, sort of resisted annexations and resisted the formation of new cities, thinking that they as a county could act as a city. Now, I have mainly a city audience here, so I know some people are probably laughing or kind of concerned about that statement I just made.
Yes.
And those people who are reacting that way, you're right. Counties are not good at that. They don't have the attention to detail that we have as city leaders. They get tied up in all sorts of other social welfare concerns and things that they have responsibility for that cities do not. Cities are really, where the rubber hits the road with regard to the quality of life issues that matter to us so much. And so what we faced that election night was trying to undo 50 years roughly of not great management under the county, who had never really been designed to do municipal issues. And now that I've been on the council for over 20 years, we just celebrated that 20-year anniversary. It feels like we've made a lot of progress, and we have, but there is still so much more to be done. But I can say it was a very unique learning experience, I think, as an elected official to get elected to something that did not exist and have to build it all. So we had no general plan, had to create it. We didn't have a police department. We didn't have public works. We didn't have any kind of economic development. Every little thing that a city does, we had to build from the ground up. And we got to do that, thankfully, with the help of the National League of Cities. Because when you need a lot of expertise in literally every category of municipal service, where are you going to go? We went to our state league and we went to the National League, and that's where we sought advice for how do we do this the best? What is the best way to establish all these things that people want in a city? What's the best way to do that? And that's where we found support and peers, and to this day, enormous input into how we are successful as a city.
So just think back on that night 20 years ago when you guys got elected after you said, "Oh my gosh, we got to build a city because it doesn't exist." What was the first thing that you did or you guys agreed to do in order to get started?
This is probably a good commentary on like the state of affairs in modern democracy. But the first thing we did was talk about what sort of a lawyer we were going to need to guide us through.
Good step.
And actually, before we hired the lawyer, we hired a municipal consultant to sort of help us. Someone who'd been a city manager and had been engaged in all sorts of different city services to sort of come in and say, "Hey, you need to think about this." And so another early step was we hired an interim city manager, someone who was basically I think sort of at the age of retirement at that point, and he sort of guided us to hiring a permanent city manager, guided us in eventually hiring the lawyer and a few other key city staff that we hired before our actual incorporation date, which was in 2003.
So you've been there for 20 years. If you had to reflect back on what has been achieved, what have been some of your proudest moments as a local leader?
There have been a lot of wins. Some of the things that stand out for me are probably getting the first giant federal grant to help us remodel Folsom Boulevard. And Folsom Boulevard is sort of the main street of Rancho Cordova. It's 4 miles long, runs right through the heart of the city. It's the backbone, basically, of Rancho Cordova. And it was a 1950s U.S. highway kind of feel with, bad infrastructure on both sides and tons of concrete. And we completely remodeled that thing, added a bike lanes on one side, protected by fencing, wrought iron fencing. We redid the drainage. We added decorative lighting. We created a median where there was none. Did a lot of work to fundamentally change what that street felt like. And I can tell you, Clarence, I don't know in 20 years if I've gotten as many compliments about any other project in the city as that one. By the time we were done, I think we probably spent upwards of 40 million, maybe approaching 50 million over 8 or 9 years doing that project. The big federal money was sort of the start of it, and then we had to continue on. But that one had a ton of impact. We rescued a historic building that had been everything under the sun from near gold rush times that's here in Rancho Cordova, and turned it into an art center with a sort of a theater space above, a public meeting space with a kitchen and an art gallery below that hosts everything from Smithsonian exhibitions to our local children's art shows. I think that has been a huge sort of memorable win. And I think, in the maybe the biggest way is just seeing our community step up on all sorts of little things. Whether we're organizing a neighborhood and that neighborhood association takes off and does great things, and those people realize, how much input and control they can have in their future and their own quality of life, and establishing those partnerships with those groups, whether it be sports teams or churches or arts leagues or whatever it may be, historical people with historical society interests. I think that's really our proudest moment as a city, in that we figured out how to do things differently without bureaucracy, without sort of a heavy hand of regulation over it, but letting people pursue the things they really love as partners with the city, not as clients or customers.
I mean, that's a really powerful answer. And, I'll just add this to some of your comments as I asked you the next question. I often say that the easy part is getting elected. The difficult part is governing. So, what surprised you most about leading your city over the last 20 years?
Oh, there's so much, so much. I think if you'd asked me on that election night, what's the number one thing that needs to be done in Rancho Cordova to turn it around? Because there was a sense that this place was failing. We had been a boom town in the 60s. We were the nexus nationally of rocket engine construction and testing. We were home to a major Air Force base. Both of those things, 20,000 employees on one side, 12,000 on the other, went away. And our boom period ended. And that's sort of when the drive for incorporation really kicked off, and then finally succeeded in 2002. So we were trying to come out of that dip. And I think what has surprised me the most is that on election night, I would have said, what we need is economic development. What I didn't realize was how complex of a challenge that is to do economic development in a place that is really struggling. That is a case for a turnaround, where you've got to rescue a community from what otherwise happens to virtually all suburban communities in the United States. You have your boom years, and you have your good years, and then you have your decline years, and then decline years can be pretty bad as people and wealth moves on to the next new thing, whichever is nearby. Almost all suburbs in America suffer from that. That's probably the number two thing that was most surprising to me. I didn't realize how Rancho Cordova was caught in sort of this national pattern of suburban style development, where a bunch of new houses get built. It's great, then there's a plateau, then there's a decline. And none of us in this country have really mastered the art of the decline and how to manage that. And I kind of think I have spent most of my time as an elected official dealing with a set of issues around that. How do you rescue a community that would otherwise fall prey to that natural history of communities, which is to decline over time?
I'd like to dig into that a little bit more because I don't think people recognize that beltway, if you will, around major cities, for lack of a better description. And you use the term suburban cities and suburban communities. What is the connectivity and being a suburban city? What would you think would be the difference? Is it the regional view of dealing with solutions? Is it transportation? Is it housing? How do you lead a suburban community that you think may be seen differently than more urban communities, for lack of a term?
Yeah, there are a lot of challenges about the language here. Urban tends to mean like big city downtown. That's how most people would use it. But urban really should mean an urban development pattern. Where things are sort of dense and multi-story, and have a lot of jobs or people per square foot. Suburban style development is sort of what I was referring to before, and suburbs can be labeled with that because that's predominantly what we are. But we also have our urban elements. That same Folsom Boulevard on Rancho Cordova has light rail running across it, and we're now adding very dense housing along that light rail. So that's a very urban element in a suburban community. So it's kind of messy, those terms. And a lot of big cities are predominantly made of which you would call urban, are predominantly suburban development style. You got single family homes stacked up next to each other for miles on end, or in large swaths. So that condition, though, definitely affects virtually every city in the United States in some way or another. There are very few exceptions, who most of us could probably name pretty quickly, where that natural history of the suburb or that suburban development style doesn't continue. But as a suburban leader now, the challenge is, because of that thing that happens to suburbs, most poverty in the United States resides in the suburbs. It's not in so-called inner cities or in those dense urban centers. Suburbs have most of the poverty. And so we are also dealing with failing transportation, that was built 20, 30, 50, 60 years ago and ages poorly over time. You have that challenge. You have the challenge of all of your infrastructure actually having that sort of an aging situation. Your schools, your parks, your recreation areas, your community centers, your libraries, everything is sort of in a constant state of needing renewal at some point. And managing that is a lot more complicated than managing, say, a new growth community where everything is 10 years old, 20 years old, and nothing is really in need of that sort of re-energization or refit.
As you were talking, it also just helps us to understand, as you get engaged in the National League of Cities, and you've been on committees for a long time in different positions, that we have all types of cities. It's just not the small, the rural. It's the urban. We got those that are trying to restart their downtowns, and it's just a real good mix of cities that make up our policies and our programs. So, getting a chance to talk about and hear from a president that is president of the National League of Cities, who's from a suburban city, I think gives our members and our listeners a view of what really makes up the National League of Cities. And so, Let me ask you, during your presidential year, you're focusing on cities as laboratories of democracy as your platform. And I love that, laboratories of democracy. Tell me about what that means to you. And when you talk about it, what you want people to hear and learn from this concept of laboratories of democracy.
Yeah, that is an interesting phrase. I really like that phrase. That phrase means a lot to me, and I think if all city leaders think about that, we can find meaning in that that all of us are already doing. We just don't recognize. You mentioned I had sort of a diversity of background and where I've lived, and I can tell you I grew up actually in a rural environment. The closest town was probably about 400 people. The next biggest city was probably about 20,000 people, and about half an hour away was a major metropolitan area, St. Louis, of a couple million people. So I had sort of a multi-level experience there, and then of course I lived in New Orleans for a period of my life during school, and then I lived in the Washington D.C. area, and now on the West Coast. So I like to think that I've had sort of a the Midwestern, the Southern, the Eastern, the far Western experience, the small town all the way to the big city. I've lived the transit lifestyle, where my only means of mobility was my bicycle, other than my feet. So there's been a good diversity of experience in my background there. But I am, in the end, a scientist, and I'm a leader of this community. Particularly, given the challenges I've outlined here, people probably understand that we had to try stuff out and see what worked. And there's really no difference between that and doing experiments the way a scientist would in a lab. You set up a hypothesis. I have an idea about how this is going to work. Let's go do something around that and test it. Let's do an experiment. And we all do that every day, whether you're cooking, whether you're trying to find a quicker route to the store, driving, maybe dealing with your kids, right?
Yeah.
What's going to work better here, or teaching someone something. We're just, it's human nature. We experiment. But I think if you think about that carefully as a city official, you can really see the benefits of the discipline of sort of going through those steps. Here's my hypothesis about how something's going to work. Here's what I think we should do about it. And then you try it. And here's the tricky part. The tricky part is you have to accept some level of risk, because every experiment can end in failure. You don't prove the hypothesis. But we probably need to ignore that word failure a little bit, because failure is actually just a step towards more learning. So if you're willing to take some risk and try something new and novel and different for an expected gain somewhere down the road, maybe not immediately, but maybe in the next iteration or the one after that, you learn, you repeat. These experiments are valuable. And I think this is how innovative city leaders push their cities forward. They're willing to take a little bit of risk, smart risk, but real risk. Clarence, I have this funny thing. Whenever I'm mayor in January, I'll go and I'll do a welcome to 2024 speech I'll be giving in a few weeks, and I'm going to say in that speech to my population in Rancho Cordova, you better hope we screw up this year. You better hope that happens, because if we don't, that means we're not trying. We're not pushing any edge. We're not trying anything new or novel. We're not trying to really improve anything. We're just playing it safe. So if you don't see us mess something up, you should be worried. And everybody kind of applauds that line, right? City staff in particular, they applaud that line. So then we get to, say, October, November in my presidential year, and I need to do the State of the City end of the year speech. Boy, then it's crickets from city staff about, where did we screw up? Because I promised we were going
Oh,
to. Now I need to hear it. Where did we screw up? What could we have done better? It's really hard for human nature, to be willing to do that. Particularly if you have, like an unhealthy level of bureaucracy, in your community, where no one wants to ever have blame for anything. No one ever wants to take a risk. So, doing those sorts of things, I think, as a city leader, sort of testing your community, testing your staff, can be valuable to figure out whether or not you have a tolerance for risk.
yeah, I love that concept and thought about taking risk. I think because we are public officials, and any risk that we take, it's a public success and a public failure, right? It gets written up in the newspaper. How would you advise, because you're going to have municipal leaders listening to this podcast and wanting to learn something from you and your experience associated with this term, taking a public risk. How do you advise someone to approach their decision making in terms of this innovation, taking risk, and being too cautious?
I think the framing of it is what is absolutely critical. The framing of it may be even more important than the execution of it, particularly if you're in an environment where you're worried about the headline. And that's sort of I'd say the cheap political advice is always, examine everything you do and imagine it's a headline, and is that okay with
Yes.
you? Whatever could happen. Maybe this is a benefit, Clarence, to less local journalism as we're seeing lately, but let's not go there in this discussion.
No, that's another episode with.
But if you frame this up, I mean, there are some steps you need to take. Like, you need to let your city manager know, and you have to have a city manager that's willing to, take some greater risks, and you have to let them know that you've got their back, that you're not going to hang them out to dry if this happens. They have to then pass that on to their line staff, all the way down to line staff, and frankly, city council can be pretty powerful in doing that. Talking up front about, we are going to try, I don't know, let's make up an issue, a new way of collecting parking meter revenue. Most suburbs don't have parking meters, but anyway. And instead of, collecting coins, we're going to do this app. And, we're not sure this app is going to have great adoption. And there might be some issues with elderly people not knowing how to, whatever. But you're going to take a risk in doing it. But if you frame it at the outset, like, we think this is an improvement, and when we come across problems, we're going to deal with them, and maybe reframe and do things a different way. When you get those complaints later on, or someone wants to make a political issue out of it, you've already said, we're not sure this is the ultimate solution, but we're working towards it. I think that, expectations of perfection are really plans for zero innovation, right? You simply cannot improve without taking some level of risk. And the more that we can be with our public and partners with them in accepting that kind of risk and working through it, the better off we are. But if we get into a gotcha environment, where for political reasons or bureaucratic reasons or whatever, people are wanting to say, gotcha, you messed up, that is an incredibly corrosive place where, progress is almost impossible. So I think we just need to be very culturally aware and be good at the framing.
Now, you sort of talked a little bit about, we have an exciting year, a big year coming up next year. And there's two things you mentioned I want to dig into as well. Next year, there's a presidential election. And this year, you and our first vice president, President Mayor Sharon Weston Broome, will be leading NLC's presidential elections task force. Talk to me a little bit about what the task force is, why it's so important, and the ways you think it's most important for local leaders to engage over the next year in the election cycle.
Well, this task force is NLC's way of making sure that this campaign has some level of focus on issues that matter the most to our cities, towns, and villages. So getting municipal issues in front of candidates, in front of committees, in front of people who are going to assume roles in the next administration, regardless of who wins, making connections with those individuals who could be decision makers or influential to decision makers. That's what this process is about. So as an organization, NLC will say, these are some priorities this year we'd like to talk about with regard to municipal issues. And we will engage with both of the presidential campaigns and all the people who are in turn engaged with those presidential campaigns to try to make those issues more obvious and relevant. Because I guess the old joke is, if you're not at the table, you're on the table, or something like that, right?
You're on the
Clarence?
menu.
We do not want to be carved up on that table. We want to be sitting at the table with our friends who are making the decisions about what gets carved up or altered. So really, this is an exercise to get us in front of those decision makers, build relationships with those decision makers, and hopefully see people who have municipal experience, city council members, mayors, city staff members, get appointed to some critically important positions in the federal government that could be of assistance to NLC in all of the cities, towns, and villages in the United States. So I think that is sort of it writ large. At the smaller level, local elected officials, we know we have a lot of political power, and often we don't exercise it. But an election year is a time when everyone who's running for a federal office, they're running for the House, they're running for the Senate, they're running for president, is going to want as much support from local leaders like us as they can get. And this is our opportunity as local leaders to step up and sort of leverage our experience and our influence for the betterment of our communities and all communities in the US. So I would encourage all of us who are sitting here as elected officials or staff to step up into those roles and get engaged in these campaigns, not so much as a partisan, which I think is far less important with regard to political parties, but if you're going to be a partisan for cities. Take the pro city message into Republican campaigns and Democratic campaigns, educate them about your issues. That's the opportunity we've got this year.
Now that sounds very exciting, and we will be lifting that up, and you will be the voice and face along with Mayor Weston Broom from Baton Rouge. Now, also, you already sort of teased this. In 1924 in Lawrence, Kansas, the National League of Cities was founded, and we officially kicked off NLC's 100th anniversary at the closing general session of our city summit conference in Atlanta just a few weeks ago. As you think of that 100th anniversary and our centennial celebration, what do you want America to know about the National League of Cities or cities at large?
I think what I would love to highlight in this centennial year is all of the great accomplishments that cities have made on behalf of our residents, working with our residents. And in that context, view the future. Where are we going from here? Because just like in the history of my community, in any community, you can chart the amount of progress that's been made, whether it's in the health, of our residents, or the opportunities for our kids, or the economic success, or the social success. There's just a lot to point to about how much higher our quality of life is, for example, than it was before. How much safer we are, and those things are often overlooked, frankly. If it bleeds, it leads. Sort of journalism has led us to be sort of pessimistic about who we are and where we are, and I think the opposite is really true. And cities have played an enormous role in those improvements and will continue to do so. And I would love to see, as part of this 100th year celebration, not only do we celebrate that 100 years of success, but we sort of chart a path forward and inspire people about what's possible in the next 100 years with regard to cities and communities all over this country.
Well, you're for sure going to get a chance to do that because we're going to be on the road. We're going to be going to cities and communities and villages all around America in 2024. So I'm excited about what we're going to do to talk about the impact that the National League of Cities has had on America. And you know what? I want to ask you for some advice. And the advice is for municipal leaders and staffers all over America as they look into the year 2024. And we know that local leaders have so many things that they're working on and challenges and opportunities to innovate. If you had to give local leaders nationally some advice as to how they move forward and keep the momentum and keep the excitement about public service as we open up 2024, what advice would you provide?
I think if you really want to magnify that feeling that most of us get from being public servants, you want to magnify that and let other people experience it. The only way to really accomplish it is to bring them in. Bring them in as partners in your community. Don't think of them as customers. Don't think of them as residents per se, or even property owners or business owners. All those labels can be distracting. Think of them as partners. The only reason we exist as cities is because several thousand years ago, some people started living next to each other and figured out that, hey, we're better off, helping each other out by living nearby each other than we are on our own somewhere. And that is magnified into, all the metropolitan areas and small towns you find now. We are better together. And that's a fundamental human thing, that we are better off working together. But too often in government, what can happen is the population can tell us, hey, I want this done, and you go do it. You're the government. I pay my taxes, you go do it. The reality is we can never do everything that wants to be done or that we want to do, and things take far longer and are far more complicated than we all wished. But by working together, by bringing people in, you can accomplish amazing things. I mean, I can compare and contrast a couple of simple things in my community. Before we became a city, we did some big neighborhood meetings and got ideas from people. And one idea that kept cropping up was, we want a youth center in Rancho Cordova. You know how long it took us to get a youth center? 20 years.
Oh my gosh.
20 years to get that done. Now, did all those people lose heart in us over that time? You would expect so, normal politics. But the reality is, we were doing so many other things towards that youth center, and in ways that perhaps are smarter than having a single youth center, that we actually did not get much pushback at all on that specific idea. Now, when the opportunity came up and everything was right and we did it, did we get lots of plaudits? Yes. But all those years of partnering with people, partnering with Little League to figure out, how can you do what you do at Little League better? What can we as a city do to help you get more kids in, to do more clinics in the fall, to help pay for kids who can't afford to pay? How do we get your teams to the championships when you can't afford to go? How can we improve your facility? I mean, all those how do we train your coaches better? How do we get more officials for you? Every little organization that we've taken on like that in that youth space has felt like they're part of the solution, not just asking government to provide it. And so I think if you really want people to understand and feel, the benefits that we all get from our public service, just invite them in as partners. Bring them to a table. Let them help you make decisions. Let them make the decisions, and you figure out how to support it. Because if you can tap into their loves and their passions, that is far more powerful than any ordinance we can ever write. No ordinance is ever going to trump, parents' love for their kids playing sports or doing art or doing something, fun on a weekend in your park. Those things are always going to win. So why not tap into that? People want to love their city the way they love their family and their loved ones. They want that sort of relationship. We just have to get out of the way and let them have it with their city and support it, broker it, catalyze it, facilitate it, knock down the barriers to whatever success they're after. And that's where we can find real success, I think, with our residents, even in times when you are fiscally strapped and it seems like everything is running against you. There is huge opportunity in just that simple act of partnership.
Well, City Speak subscribers, you've heard 2024 advice from our virologists, our scientists, our mayor of Rancho Cordova, California, and most importantly to this podcast, the president of the National League of Cities, David Sander. David, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your vision, your past, and what brought you to public service and how you've been a pillar of development for a beautiful community, Rancho Cordova, California. And I look forward to working with you in 2024 and beyond. So thank you again for being here.
Well, thank you, Clarence. It's been a real pleasure. And we are going to have an awesome 2024.
We sure are. And I look forward to it, man. All right. That's it, y'all. Thank you all very much.
Thanks for listening to City Speak with Clarence Anthony. If you like this show, let us know. Share this episode with your friends and make sure to subscribe. We're curious to hear what you think, what you want more of, and how we can improve. If you have feedback or an idea for a guest you'd like Clarence to sit down with, send us your thoughts at cityspeakpodcast@nlc.org. Join us next month for a new episode. Like and subscribe here or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.